Well, hey, welcome everyone. Really great to see everyone in person and online. I think it's our second research seminar this year, which I think is really exciting, for all of us to come back, also in person, particularly after those long COVID years. And today I'm really excited also to talk about a project that has been running for good, probably like 4 years or something, including with some people in the audience there, Crystal and Anna, who played a pivotal role in driving forward this research. And I think it's really good that finally we're at a stage where we're actually able to share some of the results that have resulted from this. So it's really about, I'll put this away, everyone can see, it's about athletic identity, unpacking what it really means. Just trying to get that. Click. Here you go. I'll just click. So what it means really, we've got ideas pretty much everywhere and floating through all sections of society, what it really means to be an athlete. There are also different advices of how to become a better athlete, whether it's more recreationally or professionally. There are discussions about, the contemporary possibilities and challenges that athletes face, but there are specific ideas what it means to be an athlete. Here, whether, some suggestions that it's just a state of mind that really makes it, that's really the essential feature that determines what athletes are and distinguishes them from others. Others' ideas are about that being an athlete means, sacrifice and dedication. That's really the core element, including the various, and I think that's quite common. What we find quite often is that in discussions of what it means to be an athlete, there are lots of different physical characteristics that are often being, mentioned and thrown around. Here's just one example of that. And this is also like a quote actually from Sally Pearson, who many of you may know, who had a somewhat different and really interesting, I think, way of making sense of that. So being at school, being who I am, being an athlete, it was hard to find people like me. There's not many athletes that can be at my level. That was kind of hard, finding people who love something so much they want to keep on doing it. So this is an interesting interpretation of really what it means to be an athlete, because here very much makes her very much different from others and really sets her apart in ways that actually probably inhibited her to connect to others. And that's quite common. So really based on that, there are lots of discussions, including among practitioners, that really develop the idea of being an athlete among coaches, but also among academies that facilitate athletes' development. So what does it really mean to be an athlete? Well, the origins of that word come from Latin as well as Greek, and I think more generally refer to ideas of, being a combatant or in public games. I think nowadays probably more common, but how most people probably understand it, or that an athlete is a person who's trained or skilled in some form of exercise, sports, or games that requires some degree of physical strength, agility, or stamina. It's probably what most people resonate with, at some level. Broadly in this, this field is probably what it really means to be an athlete. Pardon? Well, it is, and in esports, I imagine, it's like, but even that, you do need some pretty capable, highly proficient coordination, and as well as, I guess, finger skills, eye skills, you need a lot of, that's, it's interesting. I don't think there's much work on esport in this sample that we are talking about, but I think it's a really fascinating idea, even exploring what it means to be an athlete. Of course, there's a lot of debate about that, whether, well, not among esports themselves, but among others, is to what extent, they're included in this broader idea of what it means to be an athlete. And I think we can understand athletic identity as the internalization of being an athlete as part of one's sense of self. So that people think as I, the athlete. And this is one of the earlier writings by Britton Brewer, who played a key role in really developing this entire line of research, who defined an individual with a strong athletic identity as someone who ascribes great importance to involvement in sport exercise, and is especially tuned to self-perceptions in the athletic domain. More generally, also I want to highlight, if you have any questions, please jump in. I'm happy to just have a conversation as we go along. Okay. Same online, I'm trying, but I might be a bit harder if I can see you. But I'm keen to have it as a more workshop kind of discussion here. By the way, are we recording, by the way, at this point? We are recording, that's good. Okay, just checking. Okay, so why does it matter to identify as an athlete? So athletic identity has been really considered as a critical factor in driving sport and exercise behavior. There's a fair bit of evidence that has revealed athletic identity to have, a range of important consequences. Some of those are positive, like performance in sport, and general participation. But sometimes also those are potentially problematic. So some research has shown that stronger athletic identity is associated with more stress and higher depression, but also the experience of identity loss, as well as prolonged adjustment difficulties in a career after sport. Probably at least those areas are probably some of the key domains in which athletic identity has been examined. But also when looking across the entire evidence, what is evident is that the nature of those associations, even with a given outcome, vary quite significantly between different studies. I thought I had an example here, but there's some research finds positive associations with, say, life satisfactions, and others find negative associations. So it's somewhat unclear of what really athletic identity really does. I think similar, so the way in which we can really make sense of athletic identity, there are a few different probably ways that researchers have tried to do that, or have done that. What is interesting about research on athletic identity is that it's very much dominated by a very confined set of existing conceptualizations and scales, of which the AIMS, the athletic identity measurement scale, is pretty much the dominant one. There are a few other ones, but it really is the AIMS. There are lots of different versions of it later on that have been developed, like shorter versions, the AIMS 7, but also the AIMS Plus that assess athletic identity. And I'll talk about a bit more to re-unpack, because I think they have somewhat interesting ideas of what athletic identity really means. But there are a few others, but probably around 80 to 90% that really have used the AIMS in this field. So if we look at that, what it really assesses, well, it conceptualizes athletic identity as having a few different dimensions or aspects to it. And these are negative affectivity, exclusivity, and what researchers have termed social identity. So if we look at this, some examples of negative affectivities are things like, I feel bad about myself when I do poorly in sport. I would be very depressed if I were injured and could not compete in sport. Those ideas around negative activity when not being able to, compete or engage in sport. Exclusivity, those ideas around sport is the most important part of my life. I spend more time thinking about sport than anything else. And also sport is, it should say, it's a typo, the only important thing in my life. I need to participate in sport to feel good about myself. And social identity, another aspect, which items that assess this are, I consider myself an athlete, which I think is, reasonably straightforward, but also other things like I have many goals related to sport. Most of my friends are athletes, and other people see me mainly as an athlete. So I'll talk about a bit more, because you may already see that some of the items, to the extent that you are familiar with ideas around social identity, are a bit odd. And I'll talk about it a bit later. I think it's rather important to get this right. So it is, what you can see here from at least those different conceptualizations is that athletic identity is a rather complex construct. So it has some aspects related to more personal identity. What does it mean to be an athlete that distinguishes me as an individual from others, as you've seen in the quote by Sally Pearson, for instance, but also other aspects that speak to role identity, well, I'm an athlete and athletes do X or Y, those particular things like engaging in sport and, taking it seriously and really being dedicated to the sport and so on, but also potentially to aspects related to shared social identity, although I think they're somewhat underdeveloped. So one question then is, to what extent do they actually matter, those different subdimensions? Do we really need those, or can we just look at athletic identity and that is pretty much as a global construct and that's really sufficient? What is there to be gained? And another one which I've touched upon this very briefly is that the relationships with outcomes are rather heterogeneous. And that's both across different or various outcomes where we see diverging patterns, but also across different studies. So one question is, what are those relationships like when we look across all available evidence? But also, what are some of the additional factors that actually may explain variability across those different contexts? And those were some of the questions we addressed in this work. So we did it through a meta-analysis where we searched all, gathered all published and unpublished work using a range of different databases, including those that have published work like Scopus and Web of Science, but also unpublished work, which actually there's a fair bit of unpublished work in this field, which is of course important, as you're all aware of, to address publication bias. We had a very simple inclusion criteria, which was all studies that have included an assessment of athletic identity and at least one other measure was potentially eligible. And it could be any design, cross-section, longitudinal, experimental. So I flag already that the vast majority are cross-sectional studies with only a few longitudinal studies, pretty much. The final sample were 101 independent samples, fairly large, and across 22,000 individuals, and reporting around 410 effect size, which is only relevant because some studies reported multiple effect sizes. So we took this into consideration by conducting a 3-level meta-analysis that can account for the dependency between different DVs nested within a study, if you like. Okay, what did we find? Well, this is just a massive table. Like I don't need to look at all the details there, but those are pretty much all the outcomes clustered together, different. And I just want to highlight a few ones, but I think already what is interesting, you can see in the row there where you've got, it does work, yeah, great. You've got the correlation here, and here you can see, the corresponding T-value as well as the CIs. And you see, I think what the first just glance over that is actually the relationships are rather, only small, to moderate in size. They're not massive. There's actually not a lot, you could say, there's not a lot of going on really. It's not really doing an awful lot, which I think is actually a first important point to take away. But there are some notable patterns. One of them, but you can see it has somewhat, detrimental consequences for people's speed of adjustment. So the stronger people identify as an athlete, the lower the speed of adjustment. So it just takes them longer to adjust to career changes, which is fairly consistent with the existing literature. But also you got some indication that it has some negative consequences for health and well-being, in particular alcohol and drug use. So it's actually, again, the coding. This was just that they're all positive coded. That's why sometimes it's a double, or at least once they're reversed, but you can see it's a negative association with health and well-being. So it's like the stronger people identify as an athlete, the more they engage in alcohol and drug use. But also you find stronger interference with other identities that people have in life, whether it's in a student or being in academic, family life, and so on. But on the other hand, you also find a few positive associations, and where it has some, potential beneficial contributions to things like pretty core, I think, commitment to the sport, where you find a reasonably strong association or moderately strong association, but also people's engagement in general activity. So the more people identify as athletes, the more they engage in physical activity. Some are on personal resource, although there are only very few studies on that, as well as social support, both from the coach or the club, but also from the team that some of the athletes are part of. The performance association, which I just highlighted here in gray, is not statistically significant, although the associations are probably comparable, positive, 0.17. Again, that sort of speaks to the variability of the effect size across different studies overall. But potentially, if there were more studies, it might be the case that there might be a significant association, but not here. We've got no evidence for that. Actually doesn't do anything for performance, but some other aspects that potentially lead to performance, more the mediating kind of mechanisms, if you like commitment, as well as physical activity. Okay, some of the additional findings, we also looked at the range and the range of different variables that might explain a variability in effect sizes. And I think the first one to note is that there's no evidence that those associations that are just shown are moderated by age, by gender, by the type of sport, whether it's individual or more team-based sport, but also publication bias. But there's some evidence that those associations are moderated by social support. What we call it here is particularly the correlation between social support and athletic identity. That means that the more people identify as an athlete, this goes hand in hand with a sense of feeling supported. And also dimension of athletic identity. So just to have a quick look what it really looks like. So first of all, speaking to social support, this really amplifies the positive effects of athletic identity. So this, the overlap between social support and athletic identity enhances the positive association between athletic identity and health and well-being, but also in sport attitudes and behaviors. So again, just what it means is that the more athletic identity goes hand in hand with feeling that one is supported as an athlete, the more athletic identity contributes to health and engagement in physical activity. Coming to the, speaking to the subdimensions, overall those various dimensions, as we just briefly discussed earlier, didn't do an awful lot for several outcomes, including coping, physical activity, and performance. They're quite uniform, but they're varied in association with health. And I've just indicated this here. Sometimes the dimension that I refer to as social identity has been further divided into also self-identity and social identity. I unpack this a bit more because it's potentially confusing, but actually self-identity is really the self-categorization aspect. So I see myself as an athlete. That's really what it is, which of course is important for social identity, whereas social identity, again, I think it's very confusing, which is not helpful because self-identity, if you think about back even the items that I showed you earlier, really speak to this self-categorization element, which potentially is a core part of social identity or role identity, if you like. But social identity is commonly, it just makes reference to other people, and that it doesn't necessarily mean that it is, like outgroup members emotionally. So it's like friends see me as an athlete, or other people have expectations that I am an athlete. So it's a very, very odd conceptualization of what it means, of social identity. So just to conclude, to put those all things together, athletic identity is generally believed to be desirable, but it really is a rather complex identity. And what we've seen is a double-edged sword associated with some positive outcomes when it comes to commitment and engagement in physical activity, but also some negative ones, in particular more drug abuse or use, adjustment difficulties, and interference with other identities. And there's also significant variation across the studies in the relationships. And at least one of them is that to the degree that athletes feel supported as athletes, then the positive benefits of athletic identity come somewhat more to the fore. So I think what's really needed in this field is a clearer conceptualization as well as operationalization of athletic identity if we really want to advance understanding of what it even means to identify as an athlete, but also the consequences that flow from that. And the contribution, really the contribution that this makes to a range of sporting outcomes. And I think this also really highlights the the importance of dissecting different foci of athletic identity. And one way to potentially make sense of that is that we can really, look at the analytical focus of it. Does it speak more to the person, which you can see at the lower? Does it speak more to the role, or does it speak more to the group? And of course, those things vary in the inclusiveness. Is it just me that I'm included, or potentially others who are included in this form of thinking about athletic identity? And you can see that potentially overlapping. Yes, we can, people can identify as athletes, but it may refer to more what it makes them different from others. It may relate to role aspects, but also may relate potentially to aspects related to social identity. But that are probably things along the lines of we athletes, of which at least contemporary associations or contemporary research has only touched upon, but not really examined in a lot of detail. So I think really examining those different aspects within it and having clearer conceptualizations, including existing measures that we also have in other fields, would really be interesting, and hopefully also help us understand what it is actually about athletic identity and what are the different consequences that really flow from different ways of thinking about it. Okay, just to conclude, athletic identity has a potential to be a source of positive energy and health, but this varies in part on the social support that athletes receive. And we need to be clear about the meaning of athletic identity and the consequences deriving from athletes' ability to think I, the athlete, but also we athletes. Big team, massive thank you to Anna, to Crystal, who are in the audience, as well as other collaborators who are not in the audience, who've made this work possible. Thank you very much.